Your main area of study is civil wars.
That's correct. Yeah.
And you recently did a trip on your own, by yourself, to Palestine in order to look at the insurgency or the civil war that is going on there.
Right. I was interested in why people make choices to take up arms against the government, which is a really risky choice. They probably end up dead, and it's very rare that they win. So rebels don't win civil wars very, very often. And I'm writing a book about civil wars, and I wanted to try and capture both the ideas and the attitudes of the people who are doing it and get a sense of why they take the risk. Under what conditions would they take these really grave risks for a low chance at winning an outcome that's in their favor? And in the book, I ask the reader, to think about when you would do it. And so I wanted to go ask people who would do it. My objective was to meet armed resistance fighters of the Palestinian groups. So I wanted guys who were currently involved in the armed struggle. I tried to set it up from Binghamton here before I left through the internet, and some personal contacts, and I paid a couple people who were part of an organization to introduce me to these people. To my mind, they were my protection and my translators and all that, and the people who would introduce me. And after 2 days, they didn't, and they expressed it as fear that the guys with guns would be dangerous, and they weren't willing to take that risk, and they thought I was silly for taking the risk. I met a woman who could possibly make the arrangements for me. So after a few days of waiting in really Ramallah in a hotel room, the phone call came, and two guys came to meet me, and we discussed the prospects of them setting me up. To some level, I think that there is a fear of having a Westerner captured or killed over there by these guys. It doesn't do anybody any good. If you're part of the Palestinian struggle, even the nonviolent part of it, having a middle-aged American killed by armed resistance fighters doesn't do their struggle a good turn. So I think there was caution all the way around. Maybe there was only foolish optimism on my part. So I had two members of the armed wing of the president's part of the Palestinian government, and one member of the prime minister's wing. I asked them questions about what their parents thought of, they have parents like we have parents, and parents are concerned about the well-being of their children. So we talked about those types of things. We talked about the conditions under which they thought they lived, and why it was worth fighting for a change in those conditions. We talked at length about kind of what we'd say why they have their guns. Now they would describe them more as defensive weapons. They're not running around hunting down Israelis. Their description of it would be, what the Israelis come in here and attack us, and we have guns to defend ourselves. And I think the empirical evidence would bear out that's their strategy. I thought the risk would be from the guys with the guns in the room, that these guys might decide to kidnap me, or these guys might decide to kill me. And it was very clear early on, and they pointed this out to me on a number of occasions, that the risk was from the Israelis trying to capture or kill them, that I would then just be the unfortunate bystander in the wrong place at the wrong time. And so they kept saying the risk, look, think about the risk, that who's more at risk here? Us as armed guys, or you as some unarmed guy? He said, when the Israelis come in here and try and kill us, they're going to kill you, and you don't have a chance to fight back. But we have a chance to fight back. So we think you're taking more of a risk than we are. In terms of recruitment, one of the things that is integral to studying civil wars, if you didn't have armed rebels, you would not have armed civil wars. The two, if you didn't have armies, you wouldn't have war, kind of. One of the things that scholarship doesn't do is go ask the rebels why they take up arms. What is it, and how were you recruited, and try and intervene at the level of recruitment rather than after you have a war. I was trying to get a handle on that decision point by talking to people who made the choice. And their description to me over and over again was we didn't have a choice. That if you lived in these conditions, the armed violent struggle was the only thing you had going for you. And one of the members of the Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigade had been shot 3 times by the Israelis, and he took off his shirt and showed me the bullet wounds. And his line was, you know, look at what I have. What else would I do? You know, they're going to try and kill me. I don't have much choice. The leader of the Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigade cell in the refugee camp that I was visiting had been shot at 10 years old in the head by Israelis with a rubber bullet. And he spent a year in the hospital. His head was all deformed from it. And I asked him about recruitment and risk and stuff. And he said, you know, I wasn't recruited. They shot me first. And once they shot me and once I got out of the hospital, he had 4 older brothers. All of them were in Israeli prisons when he got out of the hospital. He said, what else was my life supposed to be? You know, where do you go from here, really? So they didn't see it in the same way that academics tend to see it. To them it was circumstances. It was just what happens if you live in an environment where options are continually taken away from you. Now, it's not true of all Palestinians. On a college campus, which I did, speaking to people who had more options. They didn't live in refugee camps by and large. They had enough money to pay for college, and the college gave them some hope. They would all, how would you describe it? They would all support in principle the notion of the armed rebels. They would say, oh, well, we need them, because without the armed rebels, they call them armed resistance fighters, without the armed resistance fighters, the Israelis would never concede to us. They would never negotiate with us. But they would all say things like, well, I don't feel good with a gun. You know, gun doesn't suit my psychology. I take that to mean they have some hope and they have some alternatives.
So these, what about the Islamic Jihad guy? Mm-hmm. What was his take on it? You've mentioned the other 2.
Yeah. I'll put it in my terms, but to relay his thinking, he's swept up by the environment. That as a young man, and he was a young man, he just didn't see alternatives. The refugee camp's what he's going to get. And he can either defend his refugee camp turf and fight for a better world, or this is the end of the game. That's, you know, the refugee camp is the best that he can hope for. So he didn't see it any differently from that. The 2 Fatah guys, the Islamic Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigade guys, they would seem to support the pre-67. So the West Bank and the Gaza Strip would be an acceptable settlement if the Israelis would pull out of the occupied territories, what we call the occupied territories. Mm-hmm. So I think he had a different goal, maybe more willing to fight because of that goal.